Hello, Jason.
Hey Jim, how you doing?
Doing good.
Excellent.
Are we on the air now?
We are
Okay.
live on the air. Let
Well,
me give you
let's
a
go ahead.
let's give you a quick introduction. On the line, we have best-selling James Wesley Rawles. You prefer Jim, though, I think, right?
Yes.
Yeah, and so you are a New York Times. You achieved best-selling status on the New York Times with your Patriot novel series. You're a retired U.S. Army intelligence officer and founder and senior editor of survivalblog.com, which covers survival preparedness topics and has published collected materials from this blog in several of your books. I think you've got a couple now that are kind of more how-to manuals than fiction work. You're a constitutional Christian libertarian, and boy, I got to say, I've just been a huge fan of your work. Actually, I've been rereading your books. There was one that I just finishing up with now, and hadn't read it before, and I'm glad I found it. The title is it's the one where the army guy is going. Survivors, I think, is the name of it.
Yeah, it was the second book in the series about the Army officer making his way all the way from Afghanistan to New Mexico.
Yes, and I like
collapse.
I like the different characters you have because you're spanning the economic system. You don't just have your diehard preppers and best case scenario. You've got kids that have nothing coming from an orphanage.
Right.
Other than the blood, sweat, equity they can put into something. But yeah, no, I love this series, and with everything that's going on today, I've been rereading it just because, I think it helps get you in the right mind frame to look at best preparing for some of the things we got coming at us. And boy, do we have a summer coming at us.
Certainly. Yes, I'm sure you've heard the news today about the Supreme Court ruling
Sadly,
on
yes.
homosexual so-called marriage.
Yep.
And I can say that this marks a very dark day in American history.
Indeed.
And I can predict that our nation is going to deserve nothing but God's wrath from here on out. And all we can pray for individually and as families and as church families is that God would continue to protect his covenant people. But as a nation, I think we are now doomed collectively.
It's interesting you mentioned that, Jim. Hi, this is Jim, the other co-host. Thanks so much for joining us. It's interesting you mentioned that because I was talking to a pastor friend of mine this morning, and he said almost identically the same thing that you just said. I think, with this ruling today, I think the statement that I made to him was that, our judgment draws nigh because, man, I'll tell you, if God's the same today, forever, and always, he's not going to be mocked. He's not going to be mocked. He'll respond. He'll respond, and it won't be nice, to say the least.
Yeah, I think that today's ruling is just one more reason that individual families need to be well prepared. And I think that people need to look at beyond just their own preparedness, their family preparedness, but to look at the big picture, politically, economically, and socially, in terms of the big social issues, what's really happening to America and what we face. And people need to pray to God fervently that God would put them in the right place at the right time with the right people, because judgment is coming upon our nation soon. It's coming swiftly, and it's going to be a terrible sword that passes through this nation of ours. And again, all we can pray for is God's providence and protection for individual families at this point.
Yeah, I don't think we're making it through what's coming without that. I mean, that's really our only great hope right now is providence.
Yep.
So let's talk about we've already seen tensions rising, building up to this summer with Ferguson and South Carolina, and they're definitely handling it better there. But it seems like the powers that be are really trying to divide us as much as they can on racial lines, on police versus citizen, and we're seeing a lot of social unrest fermenting right now, which I think may explode into a summer of violence. And I'm hoping not, but I think it may. What are your thoughts as to what? Do you think that we're going to be seeing more rioting happening this summer? Do you think it's part of a perpetrated plan?
It very well could happen. I think there'll probably have to be another trigger event before it does, because what happened in South Carolina actually helped diffuse racial tension. That was the unintended consequence of all of that event. People have actually stood up against racism, and I think that's commendable to see that happen. I'm an anti-racist, and I do believe in people setting themselves upon religious lines, but not upon racial lines. In fact, I have a lot more in common with black Christians than I do some of my white neighbors who are non-Christians.
That's right. Good point.
So what happened in South Carolina, I think, was really counterproductive toward the statist goals of driving a wedge between the American people and trying to create divisiveness. And, you've got to look at this from the standpoint of the Hegelian dialectic, and that is they create a crisis with the intent of creating bigger government and a outcome that suits the will and the goals of those who would enslave us. That's what when you look at history, step back and look at modern history, what has gone on ever since really since World War II, I'd say, maybe even earlier, has been the repeated abuses of the American people. I think the American people have shown great patience through all of this and not rising up and having a civil war. But there's been abuse after abuse after abuse, and the goal has always been to create more government programs, and to further entrench the powers that be and their banker buddies. And I would say they are synonymous. So people need to step back and look at it from, or step upwards and look at it from like a 30,000-foot view. Look at what's really going on and how we're being manipulated as a people by the mass media, and how we can just say no to that kind of manipulation by standing up for what's right and good and constitutional.
Jim, you're probably tired of this question, and, excuse me, we've covered the topic numerous times. However, it still is a really big topic in mainstream media, and still has a lot of coverage. And of course, I'm talking about Jade Helm 15, the upcoming military exercise. We've heard everything here on the program from don't worry about it, it's harmless, to some sort of a red list thing. I interviewed somebody yesterday that thinks that they really are basically the Vatican's army, basically doing the bidding of Rome. So, I mean, it really has covered a wide spectrum of speculation on what Jade Helm 15 really is. Do you have, from your sources, I know you have former intelligence background, and may or may not have some sources. I'm sure you probably have quite a few of them. Do you have any insight on Jade Helm 15, or what do you think is going to be going on here with that?
Well, first, I'm not at liberty to discuss some of my sources, but
I understand.
But more based upon, rather than specific actionable intelligence, more based upon my long-term experience in the Army, I look at Jade Helm more as truly as an exercise, as a CPX primarily. It does have the goal of creating a we-they paradigm between the American people and the military. That's the scary part of it for me, is that it's going to try to teach the American military to look at the American citizenry as the enemy. That's the scary thing about Jade Helm for me. in terms of specific events or activation of some red list or blue list or whatever, I don't think it's that. That isn't a particular threat, not from what I've heard and from what I've seen. But if you look at it in the context of Rex 84, for example, I think it doesn't bode well for American liberty in the long term. And that's the way I'm looking at it. I could be wrong, but to me, this is just another grandiose CPX with the goal of, again, driving a wedge between the U.S. citizenry and the U.S. military.
We've had a lot of stuff happening financially with Greece is back in the spotlight again with some of these austerity measures coming due and whatnot. There's talk about a possible bank holiday. They're not sure if the banks are going to open back up again on Monday. Do you have your eye on Greece and what's happening there? And do you think it will have a possible effect on our financial market anytime soon?
Well, I think, ironically, it's probably going to push the U.S. dollar upward and push precious metals down temporarily, because the dollar has traditionally been seen as a safe haven in times of economic turmoil in Europe. And I'd say ironically, because the U.S. dollar has no more real value than the euro or the old Greek drachma. There are probably going to be some specific events that play out in Greece. I would not be surprised to see another bail-in. I would not be surprised to see massive rioting and strikes that would cause basically a shutdown of the country. There could be some wider-reaching effects in Europe, especially if Greece exits the euro scheme and goes back to the drachma, because that could cause a whole chain of events starting in the southern tier of the European Union, with Portugal and Spain and Italy following suit. They too could eventually end up exiting the euro, and the exit of two or more countries from the euro could eventually cause the collapse of the euro, and they might have to float a whole nother currency. I'm not sure what they would call it, or whether it would even be in printed form. It might be an electronic currency to replace the euro in that event. In terms of its effects here in the United States, I think they'll probably be fairly minor at first. And again, ironically, the effects will be positive in the short term for the U.S. dollar and the trade value of the U.S. dollar in international trade. So, and I think it could also mean that the period of zero interest rates could continue even longer if there were a collapse in Greece. So people need to keep a close eye on it. I would not be particularly concerned here in the States, although there is the possibility of a banking holiday. If there's a huge contagion that takes place in Europe, and you hear rumors of a bank holiday in Europe, then don't be surprised if you also see a bank holiday here in the United States, because the European bankers, the American bankers are essentially joined at the hip.
You know, Jim, we've heard before that the amount of money necessary to secure the electrical substations, and I don't know if I'm using the correct term, but basically to shield our electricity across the nation, is somewhere between $2 and $3 billion, which, of course, with the amount of money the government spends these days, is like a mere pittance compared to what they spend on other things, right?
The government is spending more than that on Obama phones right now.
Yeah, I know. No kidding. And I read an article where it said, if we have an EMP event or a solar flare event, we could And astoundingly enough, the article claimed we could go 10 years perhaps without having having the grid back up into place like it is now, like what we would consider normal. I mean, first of all, I know the threat of an EMP, of course, is real, and the sunspot, there's not a whole lot I think we can do about that as far as stopping that. But do you see that as a one of our greatest threats to this nation is our unprotected electrical system?
Yes, and I've been harping on that time and time again in my blog. I of course publish Survival Blog at survivalblog.com. I've been warning people for years and years that, to my mind, the two greatest threats that exist in terms of the continuation of our well-being and life as we know it in these United States are the derivatives market and EMP. Those are the two ticking time bombs in my mind. And as you've mentioned, it won't take a lot to substantially increase the invulnerability of our power grids to EMP or a solar flare equivalent to EMP. It's really not all that much money. And the folks who have been trying to convince Congress to put forth the funding to protect the grid infrastructure have, to this point, been unsuccessful. And I really wish that Congress would wake up and wise up to what's really what the threat really is and what could bring the grid down. And you're right, it could go down for as long as 10 years or even a whole generation. A cascade of events like that is essentially what I put forth in my first novel, Patriots, where it started with an economic collapse and turned into a full-scale socioeconomic collapse. But as I pointed out in my novel, the real linchpin in that chain of events was the collapse of the three American power grids, the Eastern grid, the Western grid, and the Texas grid. That's the real linchpin. And whether you're talking economic collapse, whether you're talking a pandemic, or whether you're talking solar flares or EMP, the common denominator is the grids. And if the grids go down, all bets are off.
Jim, you've talked about kind of these areas that are going to be a little bit better off than some of the larger cities and whatnot. A lot of that has to do with having access to hydroelectric power.
Right.
And that they're able to get, and you talk about this in the book a bit, that they're going to be able to get up certain sections of grid and have little microcosms almost of electricity. Can you explain how that works and where
Sure.
might be some good areas for that?
Sure. I feel very blessed in my family to be living in the inland Northwest, where we have abundant hydroelectric power. And in fact, we export hydroelectric power to California and to Western Oregon, Western Washington, for example. There is a tremendous amount of hydroelectric power in the inland Northwest, and because of that, it makes it one of the safest places to live in North America. Now, earlier you mentioned my novel Survivors, and I picked the locale for that novel in the Four Corners region where Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, that little Four Corners region where those states come together as another good place to ride out a collapse, because it too is a power exporting region. In their case, it's because of the tremendously abundant natural gas generated power, and to a lesser extent coal. That region too is a good candidate for having the grid go down just very briefly. And I'm talking not just a matter of seconds or minutes before it comes back up, as an independent, smaller grid in the midst of the entire Western power grid collapsing. That could happen in the Northwest, and that could happen in the Four Corners region. And there's a couple of others that would of course, be unaffected by a grid collapse. One, ironically, is Hawaii, which I don't consider a particularly ideal place to have a retreat, but at least they have the advantage of having independent power. Now, the whole concept of power being reestablished locally in the midst of a larger grid collapse in the power generating community, they refer to that as islanding, creating an island of power in the wider sea of darkness that's going to be created in a grid down situation. Islanding is something that is not very well known outside of the power industry, and unless you have friends who work for a power producer or someone in the academic side of it, like the Electric Power Research Institute, EPRI, for example, most people have never heard of islanding. But it's something that your listeners should definitely study up on, and they need to very carefully scrutinize their local power company. Hopefully, there'll be folks like you and I who are on local co-op power that is sourced quite nearby, where it's not dependent upon the larger grid. And if the Western grid were to collapse, for example, or the Texas grid or the Eastern grid, your listeners should find out whether or not they're in an area that's a power exporter, and preferably with hydroelectric power because it's the most stable, and find out if their local utility is set up to island their power. And you can only find that out if you talk to the utility itself and know the right person to talk to. You need to talk to the administration side of that utility and say, I just introduce yourself and maybe mention, for example, if you might be an amateur radio operator, that you're a member of a local ham radio club, and that you have an interest in knowing whether or not that utility has contingency plans to island their power. And that is a key pointed question that rarely gets asked, but that should be.
Jim, we talk about prepping, and I think at this point, if you haven't started prepping, wow, are you really behind the curve? But it's not too late. It's going to cost you more money quicker, but you still have time. Generally speaking, the main items that people think of when they prep are food, water, for some people, guns and ammunition. But there are some things. I was on a radio show last week, and I pointed out that there's some things that people don't even think about. For example, sanitation. I mean, if the balloon goes up and power goes out, you're going to have somewhere to dispel of your waste. If you're going to be consuming food, there'll be waste. That, of course, we know that. And I don't think people really think about that type of stuff. Can you go over maybe some of the lesser known items or the less popular items that people often forget that are vitally important? Is there a list that you have or something?
Sure.
Something that comes to mind?
Well, speaking of lists, I actually have a list of lists at my website. If you go to survivalblog.com and the left-hand column, if you click on list of lists, that will download an Excel spreadsheet that goes through the preparations that I recommend for people. And it covers all the major bases and expands on some of those in great detail. Things like food storage, water filtration, home generation of alternative energy, the first aid, self-defense, the whole works. But yes, there are some items that are very frequently overlooked. Two in particular that I'd like to underline, and I've mentioned these in previous radio and podcast interviews, so for any of your listeners that have already heard these, my apologies, but a lot of your listeners have not, and they definitely are worth mentioning. One is the importance of having blackout curtains for your windows. If you are set up with alternative energy and your neighbors aren't, when the grid goes down and you have power, if you don't black out your windows, you're going to become a big loot beacon at night. So be prepared to black out your windows, and I mean black them out thoroughly. And the best way to test is with a night vision scope, because that's going to amplify the light, and that way you can see if you have light leaks anywhere in your blackout scheme. That's one of the most overlooked things. The other overlooked item also involves nighttime, and that is the importance of night vision equipment. It is crucial that every family that's well prepared have at least one good quality night vision scope, preferably with a weapons mount. My favorite there is the AN-PVS 14 night vision binoculars that can be used handheld, head-mounted, helmet-mounted, or weapons-mounted. It's a very versatile scope. Get the very best you can. If you can only afford Gen 2, get a Gen 2 version. If you can afford a Gen 3 Plus auto-gated PVS 14, go for it. But I'm such a big believer in night vision equipment that I think it's probably worth everyone's time to sell a couple of guns out of their collection just so they can afford to buy night vision equipment. It's that important.
Wow, that's a pretty strong statement.
Much rather have one good rifle with a night vision scope than half a dozen AR-15s or M1As or HKs. You're going to be a much more effective fighter, and if you don't have that capability, you're going to be leaving your family in great peril if things do fall apart.
Jim, you've got an article up on survivalblog.com talking about the most important preps of your life, and in that you're talking about physical fitness, your mental well-being. And I gotta say, I'm one who trains. I'm an amateur fighter, and training is a daily part of my life. But I feel that everyone needs to get in, whatever their version of fighting shape would be. That's just a key component that a lot of people are overlooking, that we really got to, as a country, we've got to start getting in much better physical shape than we are. And with that physical shape will come a lot of that, the mental health as well.
Right.
What do you suggest for people that, as far as motivation goes, getting people up and training, and what sort of physical training do you think is good to have?
Well, it all depends on people's age and any physical limitations they might have. But generally, we live in a very pudgy, pampered society. People need to just get out of their stinking armchairs and get to the gym. Go out and jog. Whatever it takes. Even if you're in a cramped little apartment, you can still put up a pull-up bar and still do sit-ups and push-ups until you're red in the face. The opportunity exists, but the excuses people make are legion. I can't tell you how many excuses I hear from my consulting clients about why they're out of shape, why they don't exercise, why they're overweight, blah, 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 blah. It just drives me nuts. These are people who could afford to pay me $150 an hour for consulting, but they look at the price of a gym membership as a barrier. It's absurd. People need to get in shape, correct their diets, create a more wholesome diet that eliminates processed foods, and basically get in shape. It's time, folks. If you've been hesitating, it is time to get out there and at least walk and split your own firewood. Don't order it split. Order it in rounds and split it all yourself, even if you live in the suburbs. For someone like me, I cut my own firewood and haul it and split it. I get a little bit more exercise, but for goodness sake, folks, the time is short, so you definitely need to get in shape.
I think that's paramount, and I'm biased because it is part of my lifestyle. Again, I'm going to be biased in this question. I myself am a Muay Thai coach. I still compete in the amateur. I've got a boxing match coming up, and so I wanted to ask you: is there a certain martial arts that you would suggest? Is there something that you do as far as hand-to-hand basic weapons training?
If you have it in your area, the martial art that I like the best is actually a mixed martial art called Krav Maga.
Yep.
It was developed in Israel. It includes boxing and jiu-jitsu and taekwondo and a lot of other arts all rolled into one. And what they basically did was they took the best and most practical and quick and easy to learn portions of each of those arts and turned it into a combined martial art. Again, it's Krav Maga. It's Kravmaga. Just do a quick web search on it. Unfortunately, for those of us who live way out in the hinterboonies, there usually isn't someone who's a Krav Maga master to train under. But you can at least find a Kempo or Taekwondo studio that's, a dojo that's fairly close by. For me, it's about an hour and a half, but based on the standards of where I live, that's not all that far. I mean, people drive 2 or 3 hours just to get to the nearest Walmart where I live. So
an hour here is the next town over. So
anyway, so I do recommend that people practice a martial art, but I think the most important martial art and the one that takes the least training is Glock Do rather than Taekwondo. Learn how to shoot, folks. It's a quick equalizer. Yes, it's no excuse for years and years of training of martial arts, but time is short, folks, and if you don't know how to shoot a firearm effectively, then you need to get that training soon, and that should be your highest priority. Martial arts are great. They're great for muscle tone. They're great for increasing your situational awareness, and they're great for situations where you may not have a weapon at hand, but they are fairly time-consuming, and we really, at this point, I wonder how much time we have. If you think that you're going to get by with a bow and arrow and martial arts, you're probably fooling yourself, folks. Get yourself a good quality 30 caliber battle rifle and a Glock 40 or a Glock 45 and practice. Get the best training you can afford. Just like with night vision equipment, it's more important to have fewer guns and the right training than it is to have more guns. Get the best training you can. I prefer folks go to one of the top flight schools if they can afford it. A school like Front Sight or Gun Sight or Thunder Ranch, for example. Or if you live in an area quite a ways away from those schools, then watch for the mobile trainers that come around. There's a number of mobile trainers out there. Look them up on the internet and find an intersection of their training calendar with your locale and get the training. The other really inexpensive training that I recommend is through the Appleseed program. Folks, just do a web search on Appleseed and marksmanship. You will be amazed. If you haven't heard about the Appleseed program, I highly recommend it. Not only will you learn some great small arms training, but you'll also get a good dose of American history along with it.
James, we know, of course, it's very easy to recognize physically what we need to do. You need to walk, as you stated, perhaps do some martial art, and even training in firearms proficiency. Now, what happens when the balloon goes up and if worst case scenario the power is out for 10 years? There's going to be a lot of death.
Yes.
A lot of death everywhere. How does a person, we know how to train physically to get our physical body in shape, but how in the world do you train your mind for perhaps bodies piled in the streets? And I hate to sound dramatic, but if the power goes out for 10 years, there's going to be there's going to be 70, 80% of the population is going to die.
Yeah, if the power goes out for 6 months and it spans a winter time, we could see a 20 or 30% die off in that first 6 months. Again, we live in a society that's pudgy and pampered. We also live in a society with so many chronic health conditions, it's not even funny. So many people have COPD and they're dependent on medical oxygen, for example. People that have kidney disease and they're dependent upon kidney dialysis. People who have insulin dependence because of diabetes, for example. Taken together, just those three ailments, we're talking about 20% of the population. And if we have a grid down situation, that advanced medical support is going to go away. Insulin won't be available. People are going to go in insulin shock and they're going to die. People with COPD are not going to have medical oxygen available. Whether they use tanked oxygen or they use an oxygen concentrator, that infrastructure is going to be gone. They're going to die. So, folks, people need to think these things through and consider what life will be like if we have to say goodbye to loved ones. We need to prepare ourselves for that. And for me, the most important thing to being prepared psychologically is faith in God. If you're not right with God, you should be. You need to sit down and seriously consider your eternal destiny and where you're going to go when you do stop breathing. Because, we're all going to die, folks. And it's just a matter of some of us dying sooner than others. But you've got to be ready to meet your Maker. And the way that you can face very perilous times relatively fearlessly is with that faith in God. You've got to get right with Christ, folks. That's the most important step, as far as I'm concerned, for mental preparedness. And beyond that, I would recommend people team up and train up with people that they know and trust. And if you're putting together a group, try to pick members who are in good physical condition and who do not have chronic ailments that will lead to their demise in the event of a collapse. I hate to sound ruthless and Machiavellian about it, but hey, if you're putting together a group, you don't want to be putting together a group of pudgy doctors, okay? Yeah, it'd be great to have a doctor in your group, but make sure he's one who loves to work out.
You're so right on that. I think it extends it into having their life together, too. If you've got people that when times are good, do they have a job? Are they able to keep them on a job? Are they able to,
Sure,
be a responsible family member?
You want responsible people, and preferably people of like faith, because I'm also of the opinion that in times of lawlessness, it will only be the God-fearing who will be law-abiding. So team yourself up with folks that you really know you can trust. People who are just rock solid. They'll be behind you 100% no matter what happens through thick and thin. That's the kind of people you want to team up with and train up with. And again, time is short, folks, so team up and train up now. It's time to team up, train up, and stock up.
James, if I could ask you, one of the other things that you kind of touched on briefly before, but I don't think a lot of people recognize or think about this, and I don't know how you stock up or prepare for this because I know it's limited, but there's probably I think last count, over 100 million Americans on psychotropic medication.
Yes.
That you can't just stop taking that. That's not something that you can't just run out of and just go, oh, well, I guess I'll go in a couple of weeks and get a new prescription. I mean, this is people. It could actually result in some sort of sound dramatic, some sort of a madness. Yeah, some sort of madness.
Huge numbers of nervous breakdowns because when doctors even today take people off of these drugs, they wean them off of them very, very slowly. Any clean break, going cold turkey from any of these SSRIs, is a recipe for disaster. I mean, there'll be huge numbers of suicides. You'll be reading about or hearing about mass shootings, family members who kill everyone in the family and then kill themselves, for example. There's going to be a lot of that goes on. So be prepared for that, folks. And if any of your listeners who are currently on SSRIs, they need to start looking at alternatives that are inexpensive, herbally based, or diet based that they can use for being on these drugs. Of course, you want to consult your physician. You don't want to make any radical steps without consulting a physician. And again, you want to wean yourself from these drugs slowly. But there are some alternatives. And some of them you can grow right in your garden. Like valerian root, for example. That's something that can be grown throughout North America. You can grow valerian, harvest the roots, you grind it up as into a powder, and you can take that as a bedtime supplement to help you sleep at night. It's non-habit forming, non-addictive, and has few, if any, side effects.
And that's
but it's something that you won't run out of. If you run out of these SSRIs, you're going to be in a world of hurt, folks. People also need to have a low-sugar diet that has an emphasis on whole foods, pure foods, natural foods, not this processed garbage that most people eat. Just the change in diet alone and the lack of coffee and cigarettes may be enough to push millions of people over the edge. But to live in a world where there also aren't SSRIs, wow. Be prepared to hunker down and don't open your door for months, folks, because it's going to get real ugly out there.
Glenn Tate, in one of his books, he actually, with one of his characters, addresses that very subject with the SSRIs and coming off of them. My question, I've got actually a family member, a very close family member, that is a type 1 juvenile diabetic. She has been her whole life. She's an adult now. And obviously, there's some issues with that if the system shuts down. Now, I know they originally had started doing, and this is something we're researching for, just to try to be as prepared as we can be, because even if you have a supply of insulin, and keeping it at 50 degrees, whatnot, keeping it refrigerated, it only has so long that it can stay good for. So we're looking into are you able to synthesize it from hogs, and is it something that can be harvested?
You can make your own pig insulin. In fact, there's an article about that in the Survival Blog archives. I would recommend that any of your listeners who are diabetic or who have friends or relatives who are diabetic need to look into the Survival Blog archives and study up on alternatives for refrigeration for medical insulin, and also for alternatives to chemically synthesized insulin itself. There are a number of alternatives. Making your own pig insulin is one of them. There's also an herbal alternative that was mentioned in my blog. Again, it's survivalblog.com. Use the search box and just type in the word insulin, or insulin and refrigeration, for example. And those articles will come right up. One of the nice things about Survival Blog is all of the articles are available free of charge. There is no super secret members only area. It's all available free of charge, and I highly recommend that your listeners take full advantage of it. I do sell some advertising there, but folks, I'm making all this available free of charge. There's over 20,000 archived articles and letters in the blog archives. They now date back almost 10 years. In August, we're going to be celebrating our 10th anniversary for Survival Blog. Take full advantage of those articles, folks. Print out the most important ones. You want to have an EMP-proof backup, but at least get yourself a memory stick and put the most important articles on that stick, especially the ones that relate to your own personal situation. Again, it's survivalblog.com.
You know, Jim, we're coming towards the end of the interview, and I wanted to just have you briefly discuss. You saw the thing that happened in South Carolina, and of course, I think within just about hours, within 12 hours, Barack Obama was out, of course, once again bashing Second Amendment and gun owners. Real quick, I know it's a big topic, and it's probably something you could go into in more greater detail. But real quick, what's your thoughts on the whole gun,
Sure.
the push for banning guns? I don't think they're ever going to be able to do it. I think there's too many of us. But what say you?
Well, they may not be able to ban them, but they could make our lives very difficult, and they can drive prices just absolutely nuts. It's happened over and over again just in the last 10 or 12 years. Folks, it's a good time to stock up right now. Right now, you can find brand new stripped AR-15 lower receivers for as low as $39 a piece. Back during the last scare, they were going for $300 or $400 a piece just for a stripped lower receiver. That's a 10 times gain, folks. So stock up while they're available. I prefer that people look around at gun shows or watch for ads in their local newspaper or whatever to find guns from private party sellers. If any of your listeners live in states where you don't have to go through a dealer, I highly recommend that you don't, that you buy those guns from private party sellers. But now is a really good time to stock up because all the manufacturers cranked up. They went to 3 shifts. They hired more employees to the point now where they've overproduced and the prices are crashing. You can find brand new in the box AR-15s or M forgeries for $600 or $700 right now. Stock up, folks, and again, preferably private party. The other thing to stock up on that's often overlooked is magazines, and there is the potential that, especially for imported magazines, we could see an executive order banning the importation of any magazine over 10-round capacity that's made overseas. So for folks who shoot the real fancy-dancy imported European guns, it's very important that folks stock up on magazines now while they're cheap and plentiful. Buy low and sell high, folks.
Well, Jim, we're coming to the end of the hour. We want to thank you for coming back on the show. It's just always great talking to you, being able to pick your mind, and I love being able to ask questions. It's one of the people that I read regularly, so we really appreciate it. Appreciate the work you're doing. And is there anything else you want to hit on before we let you go? Otherwise, I want you to give out your websites one more time where people can get your books.
I just want to mention again the importance of getting right with God, folks, because that is the crucial prep that most people in America today have overlooked. We live in a largely secular society, and if people really want a good chance of surviving what's coming, they need to get right with Christ. And just to reiterate, my website again is survivalblog.com. Please check it out, folks, and it's all free of charge.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us, and have a great weekend, and we will talk to you again soon.
Thank you so